My name is Emma Perlman, and I was 30 years old when I finally understood that my family didn't see me as their daughter anymore. They saw me as their backup plan. For as long as I could remember, I had been the strange one in the family. Not reckless, not irresponsible, just different. While my parents chased luxury and appearances like it was a full-time job, I lived quietly, carefully, intentionally. My father believed success had to look expensive. My mother believed happiness needed a designer label attached to it. And me? I drove a 10-year-old silver sedan with faded paint and a stubborn air conditioner that only worked when it felt like cooperating. I lived in a modest apartment with secondhand furniture, spent weekends hiking instead of shopping, and considered a fresh cup of coffee from a small local cafe an actual luxury. To my family, that made me embarrassing. Every family gathering came with the same comments. "Emma, honey," Mom would say with fake concern, "are you sure work is treating you well?" Dad would smirk the second he saw my car parked outside. "Still driving that antique? One day it's going to qualify as a historical landmark." Everyone laughed. Everyone except me. Even my younger sister Chloe used to tease me. "You dress like you're preparing for a financial apocalypse." I smiled through most of it because arguing never changed anything. It only made them act like I was sensitive or dramatic. The ironic part? I wasn't struggling financially. Not even close. I was a software engineer at a cybersecurity company, and my salary was more than comfortable. But while my parents spent money trying to look wealthy, I spent years quietly building actual security. Savings, investments, retirement accounts, emergency funds.
Freedom.
What nobody knew was that a large part of my income had also been disappearing into my parents' lives for years. It started innocently enough. Dad's business had a rough year when I was 24. He sounded humiliated asking for help, and I loved him enough to ignore the warning signs. "It's temporary," he promised me over the phone one night, "just until we recover." So I transferred the money. Then came another emergency. A home repair, a missed payment, a temporary cash flow issue. Then suddenly Mom needed help covering vacation expenses because everything had already been booked. At first, they repaid some of it, then less, then nothing. And somehow, without anyone officially saying it out loud, my money became part of their lifestyle. I kept helping because guilt has a way of disguising itself as love. Every time I thought about saying no, I imagined Dad losing the house, Mom crying, Chloe looking disappointed in me. So I stayed quiet. But little by little, the resentment started poisoning me, especially when they mocked the exact lifestyle funding theirs. Dad laughed at my old sedan, while I quietly helped pay for his luxury SUV. Mom pitied my apartment, while I covered pieces of their mortgage behind the scenes. And every sarcastic comment chipped something away inside me. Then came my 30th birthday. I spent it alone by choice. No fancy dinner, no rooftop cocktails, just me sitting in my apartment wearing sweatpants with a bowl of pasta balanced on my lap while rain tapped softly against the windows. My laptop sat open beside me.
Investment portfolio.
Net worth summary. Retirement projections. I stared at the numbers for a long time. Years of discipline had quietly turned into something massive. Real wealth. Not performative wealth. Not financed wealth. Actual security. And suddenly, something inside me snapped. Not loudly. Not emotionally. Just clearly. I realized I was exhausted. Exhausted from being treated like the failure in a family surviving partly because of me. Exhausted from shrinking myself to protect people who never protected me. exhausted from being their secret safety net, while they publicly treated me like a cautionary tale. I opened my email. My hands trembled slightly as I typed. Hi, Mom and Dad. Effective next month, I will no longer be able to provide financial assistance. Love, Emma. I read the message 3 times. Then I hit send. The silence afterward felt terrifying and freeing. The next morning, Mom replied, "We received your email. We'll discuss this at the family reunion next month." I stared at the screen, knowing exactly what that meant. Discuss meant ambush. It meant Dad lecturing me in front of relatives. It meant Mom weaponizing guilt. It meant everyone looking at me like I had betrayed the family. For a moment, I almost backed down. Old habits. Old fear. But then I looked around my apartment. The small kitchen, the worn bookshelf, the quiet little life I had built for myself while everyone else laughed at it. And for the first time, I realized something important. I wasn't ashamed of my life. They were ashamed that mine worked better than theirs. The reunion arrived faster than I expected. I pulled into my parents' driveway in my old sedan, parking beside Dad's brand new black SUV that practically reflected sunlight like a mirror. For a second, I just sat there gripping the steering wheel, while anxiety twisted in my stomach. Then I grabbed my briefcase. Inside it sat several printed pages. Bank statements. Investment summaries.
Proof.
Not because I wanted to brag. Because I was done letting them turn me into the irresponsible daughter in a story where I had secretly been carrying half the weight. The second I walked inside, I felt the tension. Mom hugged me too tightly. Dad smiled, without warmth. Chloe stood near the kitchen island, watching everyone carefully, like she already sensed something ugly was coming. Dinner dragged on, through fake laughter and uncomfortable small talk. I barely tasted the food. Every clink of silverware sounded too sharp. I knew they were waiting. And finally, after dessert, Dad leaned back in his chair and cleared his throat. There it was. "Emma," he began calmly, "your mother and I were hurt by your email." I met his eyes evenly. I figured. Mom folded her napkin tightly. "You blindsided us." "No," I replied quietly. I stopped pretending this arrangement was temporary. Dad gave a short laugh. "Arrangement? Emma, you offered to help." I felt years of swallowed resentment rise into my chest. "I offered once," I said. Then it became expected. The room went still. Mom's expression hardened. "We are your parents." "And I'm your daughter," I replied softly. "Not your retirement plan." Chloe looked down at her plate immediately. Dad's jaw tightened. "That's incredibly unfair." I laughed before I could stop myself. A tired laugh. The kind that comes after years of emotional exhaustion. "Unfair," I repeated. "You mocked my car while I helped pay for yours. You laughed at my apartment while I quietly sent money to keep this house running. You treated me like I was failing because I wasn't spending recklessly like you." Mom's face paled. Dad opened his mouth, but I was already reaching into my briefcase. "This," I said, placing the papers on the table, "is what my embarrassing little life actually looks like." For a few seconds, nobody moved. The only sound in the dining room was the faint hum of the air conditioner and Chloe slowly lowering her fork onto her plate. Dad stared at the papers first. Then Mom. Then Chloe leaned closer, eyes scanning the numbers. And the entire atmosphere changed. Dad's face lost color so quickly, it almost startled me. Mom blinked twice, like her brain refused to process what she was seeing. Investment accounts. Savings balances.
retirement funds, assets.
Years of discipline sitting quietly on paper. Chloe looked up first. Emma, holy hell. Dad finally found his voice. How do you have this much money? I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking. By not spending everything trying to impress strangers. Mom's eyes narrowed defensively. Are you trying to humiliate us? I stared at her for a long moment. No, I said softly. I'm trying to show you that I was never struggling. You just decided that because my life didn't look expensive, it had no value. Dad rubbed a hand over his face. For once, he looked older than I remembered. We thought... He hesitated awkwardly. We thought you were barely getting by. A bitter smile tugged at my mouth. Because I wasn't showing off? You never acted like you had money, Mom said quickly. That's because financially secure people usually don't need an audience. The words landed harder than I intended. Mom stiffened immediately. Dad looked wounded. But neither of them denied it. Chloe slowly flipped through the pages again. Wait, you've seriously been helping them this whole time while saving all this? I nodded once. Her expression changed completely. Not mocking anymore. Not teasing. Just stunned. Emma, she whispered, why didn't you ever say anything? I let out a slow breath. Because every time I tried to set boundaries, I felt guilty. And every time Dad joked about my car or Mom pitied my apartment, I convinced myself maybe I really was selfish for wanting my own future. Mom looked horrified. We never wanted you to feel selfish. But you did, I said quietly. Every single time. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Dad stared down at the papers again, jaw tight with embarrassment. I didn't realize it had gotten this bad, he admitted. I almost laughed again. Not because it was funny, because hearing him say that after years of ignored conversations felt surreal. It got bad a long time ago, I replied. Mom crossed her arms tightly. You still could have handled this differently. Chloe suddenly spoke before I could answer. No, actually, she couldn't have. Everyone turned toward her. She looked directly at our parents. You guys made fun of her constantly, Chloe said bluntly. You acted like she was some sad little charity case while taking her money behind the scenes. Mom's face flushed red. That's not fair. It's completely fair, Chloe shot back. You never even stopped to ask why Emma lived differently. You just assumed she was failing because she wasn't obsessed with appearances. Dad leaned back heavily in his chair. For the first time in my life, he looked genuinely ashamed. I thought... He paused slowly. I thought I was motivating you. I stared at him in disbelief. By humiliating me? His eyes dropped immediately. The room went quiet again. Then Mom spoke, her voice smaller now. We didn't force you to help us. No, I admitted. You didn't. And that was the complicated part. Nobody had held a gun to my head. Nobody had demanded money outright. But emotional pressure could become its own kind of trap. You didn't force me, I continued carefully. But every time I hesitated, I felt like a bad daughter. Every time I tried pulling back, there was another emergency. Another reason you needed me. Dad pressed his lips together hard. Chloe looked furious now. You know what's crazy? She said to our parents. Emma's the only one who actually planned for the future, and somehow she became the family joke. Nobody answered her. Because nobody could. I watched Mom glance around the table, almost like she was searching for someone to rescue her from the conversation. But there was no rescue coming. Not this time. Dad finally cleared his throat again, though the confidence from earlier was gone. So what happens now? I looked at him carefully. Now you figure out how to live without depending on me. Mom looked panicked. Emma? I'm not abandoning you, I interrupted gently. I'm setting boundaries. Dad rubbed his forehead slowly. Things are tighter than you realize. I know exactly how tight they are, I replied, because I've been helping cover the gaps for years. That shut him up immediately. Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Honestly, maybe this needed to happen. Mom glared at her. Whose side are you on? Chloe frowned. This isn't about sides. It's about reality. Then she pointed lightly toward me. Emma shouldn't have to sacrifice her future just because nobody else wanted to change their lifestyle. I felt something strange hearing her defend me. For years, Chloe had laughed along with everyone else. Not cruelly, but enough that it still hurt. Now she looked at me differently, like she was finally seeing me clearly. Dad exhaled slowly and stared at the bank statement one more time. You really built all this just by saving? I nodded. Saving, investing, living within my means. He gave a hollow laugh. All these years, I thought you were playing life too safe. And all these years, I said quietly, I thought maybe I was too. Mom suddenly looked emotional. Not dramatic. Not manipulative. Just shaken. We never meant to make you feel small, she whispered. The honesty in her voice almost hurt more than the insults ever had. Because part of me believed her. They hadn't woken up every morning planning to hurt me. They had simply become so obsessed with appearances that they stopped seeing me clearly. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing myself clearly too. The conversation slowly died after that. No screaming. No dramatic exits. Just exhaustion. Dad gathered the papers carefully and handed them back to me like they weighed something. Maybe they did. Maybe they weighed years. Chloe followed me outside when I finally left. The cold evening air hit my face like relief. You okay? She asked quietly. I leaned against my old sedan and laughed softly. I honestly don't know. She shoved her hands into her jacket pockets. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. I looked at her, surprised. You are? Yeah, she admitted. I think we all got so used to seeing you as the weird, practical one that we never realized you were actually the smartest person in the family. Emotion caught unexpectedly in my throat. For years, I had wanted someone, anyone, to understand me. And suddenly, Chloe did. She stepped closer and lowered her voice. They're scared, you know. Good, I said automatically. But I didn't actually mean it. I was angry.
Exhausted.
Relieved. Heartbroken. All at once. As I drove home that night in my old sedan, the city lights blurred softly across the windshield. For the first time in years, I wasn't carrying my family on my back anymore. And even though it hurt, I could finally breathe. The days after the reunion were strangely quiet. No guilt trips. No angry phone calls. Just silence. Part of me kept waiting for the backlash, for Dad to explode or Mom to cry and accuse me of tearing the family apart. But instead, 3 days later, Mom called sounding smaller than I had ever heard her. Your father and I have been talking, she said carefully. And we think you were right. I sat down slowly on my couch, stunned into silence. Dad got on the phone next. I spent too many years trying to look successful instead of actually being responsible, he admitted. I think somewhere along the way, We started relying on you without realizing how unfair it became. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was real. Over the next few weeks, little things started changing. Dad sold the SUV. Mom canceled the country club membership. They started cooking at home instead of eating out constantly. And for the first time in my life, they asked for advice instead of dismissing mine. One evening, Dad called asking if I could help him compare refinancing options for the house. Another night, Mom proudly told me she had downloaded a budgeting app. Chloe found the whole thing hilarious. "You basically broke their brains," she told me over dinner one night. I laughed harder than I had in months. The biggest change wasn't financial, though. It was emotional. The mocking stopped. Dad no longer joked about my car. Mom stopped looking at my apartment with pity. And slowly, awkwardly, they began treating me like someone they respected instead of someone they tolerated. About a month after the reunion, my parents invited Chloe and me over for dinner. Not at some expensive restaurant. At home. Mom cooked pasta herself. Dad grilled vegetables in the backyard wearing an apron that made Chloe laugh so hard she nearly dropped her drink. For once, nobody was pretending to be anything. After dinner, Dad pulled me aside quietly. "I'm proud of you, Emma," he said. "I should have said that years ago." The words hit harder than I expected. Because all those years, underneath the resentment and frustration, a part of me had still wanted his approval. I nodded slowly. "Thanks, Dad." As I drove home that night in my old sedan, windows down, cool air rushing through the car, I realized something important. Standing up for myself hadn't destroyed my family. It forced us to finally become honest with each other. And for the first time in a very long time, I no longer felt like the outsider.